Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm really happy to have everybody here on this Wednesday as fall is settling in. I don't know where each of you is from, but here in rural, well, suburban Pennsylvania, the fall is really beginning to hit with wind and lots of rain and the leaves all off of trees. And it's kind of a melancholy um, time of year, and um, I think a lot of people can relate to that. If anybody here is new and would like to introduce themselves, feel free to raise your hand and I'll call you in turn. Um, and yeah, that is a custom we have at the beginning of every call, is that if you're new here, we would like to hear from you. I mostly see repeat folks on repeat here that have been here before. Thanks for returning.
I'm not new, but I'm long time no see. Hi, Charles.
Hello.
Welcome. Where in West Virginia are you from?
I'm from Fayette County, New River Gorge, but I live in Charleston.
Ah, I was born in Morgantown, but my mother's family's from Spencer. So, um, yeah.
And
It
I
would,
used to own the Underground Railroad.
oh, wow. All right, so let's get started. Um, we're going to do it a little differently tonight. Instead of reading a poem to ground, I'm going to introduce Charles, and he's going to do a grounding exercise, and then we'll begin our conversation. Um, Charles and I have been friends for almost 15 years. I've known him for a long time, and I worked with him for a while as well. And he's one of these people that has like had a major influence on my life and on a lot of the lives of a lot of people in my orbit. And he has this influence through public speaking and writing and workshops that he holds, which are really beautiful spaces to join. He's the author of Sacred Economics, a book a lot of people have heard of, but he's also the author of a book called The More Beautiful World Our Hearts Know Is Possible, which is a book exactly about what it sounds like in that title. The Ascent of Humanity, which is a major book of philosophy that I read the entirety of Game of Thrones in about 2 months, and it took me 6 months to finish Ascent of Humanity just because it was so dense and so packed full of ideas that I had to really sit back and reflect on. So, highly recommend that book. Um, all of his books are online for free to read if you would like to seek them out. And he's here tonight to talk with us about story. And last week we had Drew Dellinger, a poet, who came to talk about cosmology and the relationship of the cultural moment that we're in to these larger stories. And Jody and I thought that it would be a really good idea to continue on this theme of culture, and in particular with the stories that we operate by in our culture. And the story of the local peace economy and the war economy is one story we're all familiar with here, but there are so many others that guide us and frame how we view the world. So, with that, I want to introduce Charles and then we'll begin our conversation.
Great. Well, thank you, Marie. Yeah, so a grounding exercise, yes. Yeah, okay. I guess we'll close our eyes for this and be aware of the screen in front of you or near you. Yet at the same time, feeling that we are together, that we are gathered. Each of us breathing different air, hearing different sounds, but sharing something in this moment. And present to the reality that there are maybe 20 of us living and breathing. And we feel the reality of the presence of each other. And in a minute, we will talk about story. But before that, just linger for a few moments in the physicality beneath the story. Okay. So I'm opening my eyes now. I think I'll start by telling a little story. Well, the story may challenge some people's belief system. And I thought, well, maybe I shouldn't, come across as too woo. But then I thought, probably everybody here has had the experience of telling somebody a story that they cannot receive because of their investment in a belief system. I mean, this happens just to take something that's very familiar to Code Pink people. And by the way, I'm really honored to be present at a Code Pink meeting. I love Code Pink and love Jody, known her for many years, highest admiration. So I'm sure that many of you have had the experience of maybe telling a story about, what's happening in Gaza and not citing statistics, but telling the story of, maybe a child who watched her whole family die, or some story like that. Many, many heartbreaking stories. And you tell it to somebody and maybe you post it online and the response is fake, lies, or something like that. The story cannot be absorbed, cannot be heard. So I invoke that at the beginning, just to invite you to relax the skepticism that might come, and maybe some of you will just love the story. So I don't know, but I just wanted to invoke that just to kind of soften the boundaries. Anyway, so on with it, Charles. Well, I was at a conference recently and I held a panel of, they're called spellers, nonverbal autistic people who for many years, for decades actually, were believed to be nonverbal because that they just did not have enough brain, did not have enough functionality. They were at a sublingual, like beneath, they could not use language. They were too dumb. That was what it was believed. They have a condition called apraxia, which messes with motor planning. So it would be as if you were trying to operate a backhoe and you know exactly how to do it. But someone messed with the machine, and you push the lever to raise the shovel, and instead it swivels, and you push the lever to move forward, and instead the arm lowers, and it's just not working. That's what happens with them when they're trying to make themselves talk. They can't do it. They do have gross motor control, though, and with great difficulty, they have been taught to point to letters on a letterboard and thereby painstakingly spell out words. And it turns out that when they're taught to do this, turns out that they're not of subnormal intelligence, after all. In fact, quite the opposite. They are, many of them, of extraordinary intelligence. Not only that, I don't know if you've heard of the podcast, the telepathy tapes, but they exhibit telepathic abilities as well. I was treated to a demonstration of this. I visited the spellers. I mean, like, to all appearances, you're dealing with, like, pardon the expression, but an idiot. Like, they're, making funny gestures, and like they're not behaving like a normal person. But the demonstration was, I wrote a word. The mother of one of the spellers looked at the word, then across the room, the speller spelled it out. He couldn't see. I mean, it was not rigorous conditions, but okay. So the panel was beautiful. I didn't even talk about telepathy on the panel. That wasn't the point. The point is that these are human beings who deserve dignity and compassion, and they and that they have unique perceptions because they are not involved in the human drama in the way that we are. They have a unique perspective. They're and they're not fully embodied in the way that we are. So they see things that we cannot see. And I made the general point that for our civilization to pass the threshold that we are at, we need to bring in all that we have marginalized, all that we have exiled. And that would include not only cultures and races that we have exiled, but also human capacities and ways of seeing and ways of knowing. All has to come in. So that was the point I was making. And the spellers demonstrated it so beautifully, that their intelligence, their compassion, their humor. I asked them, what is it like? What was it like? Compare it, like what was it like before you learned to spell and after? And they said things like, it was like being liberated from prison. Because you can imagine, to be an intelligent person like yourselves, and nobody even knows it, and you can't communicate to anybody, and they think you're so dumb that they put you in front of, in a daycare with maybe your limbs restrained in front of SpongeBob SquarePants for 8 hours a day, thinking that you have no mental capacity to learn. So, yeah, it was very moving. Well, at the conference was a well-known scientist of my acquaintance, and I won't mention his name, but he's an atheist, rational materialist. And he was invited to meet one of the spellers and have a demonstration of telepathy. I'm like, okay, so-and-so is going to get red-pilled here. Well, I followed up with him a few days later, and I'm like, well, so how was that? And he said, oh, it's so sad. These kids, these young people, obviously what's happening, not only do they not have telepathy, they really aren't even communicating, but the parents are kind of subtly moving the board and cueing their child, unconsciously cueing them to point to letters as if they were actually spelling something and projecting intelligence onto a person that has none. But I don't dare tell them that because they would be so disappointed. But there's nothing going on here. And I was like, okay. To think that. So that's the story, okay? It is an interpretation of an experience, of an experience of your senses. It fits all the data points. Like, ultimately, the story that you accept, ultimately, you cannot choose it based on facts and logic alone. The people who promote war, for example, who excuse genocide, they are not inferior to ourselves in cognitive capacity. In fact, sometimes it seems that the smarter somebody is, the better able they are to rationalize the horrible and the absurd. So, if not based on facts and evidence and logic, how do we choose our stories? So, with this scientist, you can interpret the data points, and yeah, you can interpret it that way. But there's more to the story than that, because for one thing, his interpretation was required in order to maintain the edifice of his belief, his identity, his social status, everything that he's associated with. It would actually take a lot of courage to change that belief. It'd be very difficult. Secondly, though, there is you might call it a state of consciousness or a state of being that is part of that belief. So to believe that the parents are unconsciously faking this thing would require that they are kind of foolish, naive, gullible, that this possibility has never occurred to them, that they have never, that they're just such poor observers of reality that they would never question whether this is really happening. He says, well, it's just their wishful thinking. But it's not just an intellectual assumption. It includes an attitude toward human nature, an attitude towards yourself. It's kind of arrogant, actually. And then there are the people who train them to spell. I witnessed one of those sessions when I visited another facility where the spellers are learning. It is a painstaking process. Usually not the parents, by the way, who are doing it. It's other people who are training them, where you just have to be on it for hour after hour after hour, week after week, because it's like, it would be like you or I trying to learn about a unicycle, Marie. I mean, it's like really hard for them to learn. It takes incredible patience. So you'd have to also assume that those people, they're just wasting their time chasing rainbows for like $15 an hour. I mean, they get paid almost nothing. So and I said to the scientist, I'm like, yeah, I can't prove you wrong. And you have company. A lot of people believe as you believe. I'll just add one little coda to the story. I was on a call today, and here I am outing myself as even more woo with a guy who funds a lab in Spain that tests that researches. It's called extraocular vision. Basically, they train children to wear. Have you ever worn one of those mindfolds that you use for psychedelic journeying? It's like you can't, like, it is like pitch black, and they learned to read wearing those. And they've, published research, again and again, and it just does not pass muster with the skeptics. And the guy shared with me the most recent experiment. We met all of their criticisms, and now the new objection is that, whoa, you haven't accounted for photoreceptors in the skin. Like, that must be what's going on. They're like reading books with their skin. Now, it is a patently ridiculous. I mean, you try that. Patently ridiculous, but okay. So now they repeated the experiment with like their skin covered. And they said, oh, and also you haven't eliminated the possibility that somehow light is getting in. So then they put a luxometer inside the mindfold to measure how much light was there. And it was like nothing, like a couple micro lux or something like that. And I said, that's not going to work either. They're just going to accuse you of fraud. There's no way you can prove it. And so this is just kind of a long-winded way of pointing out that there is an emotional and psychological and social component to the stories that people hold. And it raises the question, because this is important, if we want to change people's stories, and I guess those of us on this call might think first stories about stories that justify war. If we want to change those stories, change the worldviews that justify war, how do we do that? I don't have a quick answer to that question. I don't know the answer, but I know that it's a good question. And maybe that question can invite, maybe in the breakout session later, actually, we could use that as an invitation for stories. A lot of times we have this instilled habit in modern culture to answer a question with an answer. But sometimes a question is better answered with a story. And so maybe during the breakout session, people can share stories of those rare occasions when somebody actually did change their belief. How did that happen? Because beliefs are not just vapors in the brain. If they are associated with your identity, all that you've invested in, and your psychology, then to change a belief is to change yourself. It's like something in you has to die and something is born if you really change a core belief. And it's a painful and frightening process. And maybe if we recognize that, we can hold others in more gentleness and more support as we create conditions for their beliefs to change. You may not get the satisfaction of defeating an opponent in a debate, but that satisfaction is short-lived when you realize that they just go scurrying home to their sources and read the whatever website that will debunk your criticisms, and they will be satisfied that they were right all along. So we don't really want to do that. Yeah. So so the question might be answered with stories, but we can get into that later. Maria, maybe I'll hand it back to you and see if how you want to respond or what you want to bring.
Yeah, I was from my own perspective and some things that I was thinking about bringing to this. So my background is in archaeology and ancient Greece, in particular the Minoans and Mycenaeans, very specifically, so the Bronze Age Greeks. And that is firmly Homer and the world that Homer was describing in the poetry that he composed many years after the Bronze Age was about Bronze Age Greece, was about Mycenaean Greece. And the poetry that Homer produced was told around a campfire. Well, not a campfire, but like a fire in a building, a big central fire, and everybody sat around. And a king or a person who had power in a community would bring in bards, itinerant bards, who would and people would come together um, and listen to stories. And I had the experience of going to a conference in Maine called the Great Mother Conference, where a really dynamic and powerful storyteller um, recounted the story of the Odyssey in a room very similar to a Mycenaean Megaron. And there were teenagers there and little children and adults, and everybody sat around captivated. And I spent a lot of time thinking about this story. What is this story trying to impart on the community? And the gathered group heard tales of that reified the power of the divine in the world, fate, um, the relationship between men and women and men and the gods, um, how earthly power is held and by whom, um, what it means to live, what it means to die, um, and these very, very specific cultural um, commonalities. And these commonalities were taken for granted by everybody in the room as just truth, right? And I think that when you listen to these, when people read the Iliad and the Odyssey in a class, either in college or in high school, that it feels very foreign to them, that things that, kind of boring, there's a lot of description, they don't really understand why there's the repetition, and really the morals of the story feel sort of alien. And I think that that is, that's because we live in a very different culture, and we're reading about a 4,000, 3,500-year-old culture, um, and what they felt was really important to impart on the younger generation and for the people who held power in their communities. Um, so storytelling is this really profound way we can gather together people and reassert commonalities. And I don't think we do that much today, except for movies, sometimes books, and people talk about books, but not every book is read widely in our culture. And then there's, the media, which is largely propaganda. And the propaganda is trying to assert different stories at the same time. And we're in this very culturally confusing moment because they're the cultural stories that held the world together in some ways have completely fallen apart. And we haven't yet built the new stories that will begin to hold people together. And um, Homer was actually writing and living in a time when some old stories were dying and a new culture was being born. And so that's why I thought about Homer, and that he was trying to write down these oral stories that had been told for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. He was trying to write down and preserve what he felt was really important to preserve, to hold on to, and pass down to other generations. Um, I'm not um, sure what we will be passing down to future generations about this time, but I do know that that we experience a lot of stories. We assume that they're true, um, and a lot of them are based on a whiffy foundation. And I've really enjoyed deconstructing some stories that I thought were true my whole childhood, my whole upbringing, and then realized that they were based on thin air largely. And a lot of the reason that I've come to that understanding is by reading Charles's book, The Ascent of Humanity, where he deconstructs a whole lot of the cultural stories that we sort of swim in, and shows that they're based on sort of a fundamental lie or a fundamental misunderstanding. I guess it's not really a lie. But I don't know, Charles, maybe you could talk about some of these foundational stories um, that we sort of have incorporated into our culture, and how they really don't hold up to.
Yeah. So there's two kinds of stories that we're kind of interchanging here. One kind is the uh, cultural narration of a belief system that is often implicit. And then on the other level, there are what we normally think of as stories. So and so did something at a certain time, and here's why, and here's what happened, and that, these could be mythological stories, or they could just be stories about people we know, stories in the news, stories in entertainment. And so the second kind of story um, draws from and contributes to the first kind. The first kind is usually implicit. So you can name them and see them operate everywhere. And some of the ones that I work with are like most fundamentally the story of separation, which you don't hear people often say any of this explicitly, but the story of separation says who you are, and says you are a discrete, separate individual in a world of other. Then there's the story of force-based causality, that things change in the world when you exert a force on them. And therefore, a theory of change built on that is that the more force you have at your disposal, the bigger the change you're going to make. So we have to get more money, get more numbers, get more power, and then we can change things. Another of these basic story, they're kind of story templates, but it's a story of us versus them that explains bad things happening in the world because bad people are doing them. And therefore, the solution is to overcome the bad people with good people. Related to the story of force-based causality, actually. And the story of control is another one. These are all tied together. That progress means an increase of human control over the material world and over the social world. So it narrates history as an ascent. That's why the semi-ironic title I chose for the Ascent of Humanity, that narrates history as a constant improvement, and that is supposed to bring paradise, supposed to bring utopia as we master the material world and apply the means and methods of that mastery to the social world. Also, we should be able to engineer a perfect society. That's called progress. And it, there's many, many other stories I could name. The story of the survival of the fittest, for example, that is then applied to the evolution of human beings and human society. So these are all operating in the background. And then the second level of stories that we tell about ourselves, about each other, about the world, this happened, like the story I told at the beginning here, the story of even some of the political stories, the story of plucky little Israel beset by enemies on all sides, fighting enormous odds to secure a safe homeland for Jews who are hated around the world. Like, that's a story. No one explicitly says it quite in that way, but it is like the engine of many, many other stories. And if you hold that story, any anecdotal story that comes in, about, say, starving children in Gaza, will be evaluated according to whether it fits this meta story. And if it doesn't fit, then it will be rejected. Stories like these meta stories have an immune system. Well, a lot of the foundational mythologies, the foundational narrations of our society are disintegrating in our time. Even the story of the separate self, the story of the war on nature, the transcendence of nature, the story of progress, the story of control. They're not working very well, these stories. They're not bringing their promised results. So we begin to disbelieve in them. And as Marie said, we don't have a commonly held replacement for those stories. I call this the space between stories that we're in right now. That is a dangerous situation when people's ways of making sense and meaning of the world and making sense and meaning of themselves in the world falls apart. That ensuing vacuum of meaning and identity it attracts all kinds of replacements to fill the vacuum. Stories, fascistic stories. You know, a demagogue or a fascist can come in and say, yeah, everything you were told is wrong and the whole system was corrupt. Here's the way things are. And they provide an identity. Now you're part of something again. It's confusing because there's truth to what they were saying. The system was corrupt. It wasn't working. It didn't make sense. But when we are not comfortable staying in that empty place between stories, when we panic, then we become vulnerable to stories of fascism, stories of war, stories of hate, stories of blame. And they can be very insidious. Should I say one more thing about that? To be provocative? You know, left and right, Republicans and Democrats, they agree on one thing. They agree that the problem is those terrible people on the other side. And that they are in full agreement. The identity of the terrible people, they disagree. You know, during the previous administration, it was the dangerous right-wing extremists and the anti-vaxxers. And now Trump has taken over the machinery of the state and has not dismantled the regime of propaganda and censorship, but merely turned it on to a new set of bad guys. Now it's Antifa that is a threat to the country. And I know a lot of people don't want to hear this. They want to hear that, yeah, the, MAGA extremists and the anti-vaxxers, those were the actual bad guys. And now the bad guys are in charge and the good guys are, but it's the same template of thought. And it provides simple solutions to complex problems, simple but false solutions. Things get complicated when you grant to the bad guy a modicum of humanity and complexity. And when you understand that maybe the drivers don't drive the machine, but the machine drives the drivers. That when people enter power, they become creatures of power. And that it is a system and not bad individuals that are running the world-destroying machine. That's uncomfortable because then what do? We have a formula for solving a problem that's created by bad guys, by perpetrators. The formula is to get rid of those guys, to kill them, defeat them, destroy them in a debate. We don't have a formula, really, to change a system. And it's good to recognize that. It's good to acknowledge that we don't know how to do this, because then we will no longer be seduced by false solutions that often involve the same patterns of behavior that are maintaining hell on earth. If you're fighting evil, anything is justified because you're fighting evil. And in so doing, you become evil yourself without even knowing it, all the time believing that you serve the good. And whoever your villain is, you sit down with them, and it's usually, not always, but usually hard to escape the conviction that they believe in what they are doing, that they have a story in which they're the good guy. And if you think that they're a monster, to them, you seem like a crazy person. Because they're like, no, I'm a good guy. I know I'm a good guy. Everything I'm doing is justified and necessary. You go and talk to an extreme Zionist or a chemical industry lobbyist or whoever you love to hate. And they're usually not so different than the rest of us. So makes things difficult to solve, but at least we're not going to pursue false solutions, and we can get down to the real business of serving a more beautiful world. So
I wanted to jump in and say that put a little plug in for the Peace Economy workbook that Jody and others created before I was here. That's in essence what the workbook is trying to do, which is to highlight all of the ways that we individually have been sort of hijacked by this system. So Charles is talking about, the systems are sort of driving the people's beliefs, and that we're not really aware of it in our own lives until we do something that highlights it and makes us uncomfortable when we have to go, oh yeah, I see that now. I do that. I do recognize that in myself. And there's this little moment of cognitive dissonance about that. And the workbook actually has you reflect on those kinds of inconsistencies within yourself, because it's really easy to point the finger out there and say they're inconsistent, or they're illustrative of a problem in our culture, or that this system is corrupt. But it's really enlightening to go and to really examine how these parts of the war economy have weaseled their way into our lives and into our belief systems and into our in the way that we enact in the world. Um, and I really think that that's the one really beautiful thing that the workbook does, is ask us to ponder that for a while. Um, and it's a really great contribution for that. Um, this might be, do you have something to say, Charles? You have a smile on your face.
no, I'm just thinking of our friend Jody, and like she doesn't hate anybody, you know. I mean, I've had conversations. She doesn't hate Donald Trump. She doesn't hate Nancy Pelosi. She doesn't hate any of these people. And I think that, yeah, like I don't hate Donald Trump either. And then during the election, people thought that must mean that I love him or that I support him. But I'm like, no, let's not simplify the man. Even if you are fighting somebody, if you are under a delusion about who they are, then you will not even fight them effectively. Like, let's actually, but also just the template of dehumanizing people. It's not like it's okay to dehumanize some people because they're Republicans, or dehumanize some people because they're Zionists, or to think that they are a lesser sort. of being because they're on a different side, like that habit is the same habit as other forms of dehumanization, which is akin to also not just dehumanization, but the desacralization of all living beings. This is a fundamental pattern that and it's at the essence, it's at the root of war as well. To wage a war, you have to dehumanize the enemy. You cannot really have war without dehumanization. So this is maybe an example of what you were talking about, Marie, like this inner work to identify war thinking within ourselves, not in a campaign, to use a war metaphor, a campaign to purify ourselves and to qualify for love, to become one of the good guys. No, same thinking comes back in that campaign. It's simply to be in reality. And the reality is that every single one of us is a sacred being, an entire universe and subjectivity unto themselves. And when we're in that truth, then we can actually address the problems on the level of their cause, and not just on symptoms. So, yeah.
So I thought it might be a good time to see if anybody wants to jump in and ask a question. You might want to, in the reaction button, raise your hand and I can unmute you, or you can unmute yourself. Is it Z? You can unmute yourself. Oh, you're clapping. You're not raising your hand. I thought you were raising your hand.
I didn't know if it was a raised hand or not. It's Zai.
Zai.
Yep. For Ziola. Anyway, I think maybe respectfully, highly respectfully, to Charles, I think that the thought might be a glitch, and that because belief is feeling and feeling is flesh. And this might be an avenue to explore. I don't know. But the flesh, and then it's a larger conversation, but I think focusing it as like a thought or something we have to figure out, or right. But I think it's more, I think, right, all thought, but I think it's flesh. Or I believe it's, because I'm an anthropologist and archaeologist, and you dig back through, and before the thought is the flesh, before the thought is the feeling, like the moment before thought is possible, right? Like that, like before the thought of that created anything, right? Or whatever, there had to have been something. And what is that something? And that something possibly is feel. And how do we feel is through flesh. So it's just kind of thoughts that thoughts I were, and feelings I was having as you guys were talking. That's all.
Yeah. Thought, feeling, like emotion, body, mind. I mean, these divisions that modern society has set up can really confuse the issue, you know. But like as this, maybe just even to return to the story I opened with, you notice in your body a different feeling when you occupy the story of, oh, those silly parents, wishful thinking, those children don't have anything going on inside, and compare that with the feeling of being in the story of, wow, these children are remarkable and extraordinary and have abilities that I didn't even know existed. Like, it's a very different feeling.
Yeah, it's
And
a better feeling too.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And you can even ask the question as kind of you're getting at, what comes first, the thought or the feeling? You know, maybe it is a state of being and a comfort with certain feelings that even allows a certain thought to come in. So yeah, it's very deep and embodied, exploration. It's not just about ideas. Yeah. Does anyone else want to chime in here? Or?
Hello. Hi. I wanted to chime in a bit. I'm sorry, I jumped in late, but I think one of the things I'm seeing, I heard the part about not projecting this monstrosity. However, what we're seeing is that this is a real Holocaust happening before our eyes, and people are acting in completely, utterly monstrous ways. So, I mean, I'm looking at Israeli society as one example, and there's just this attachment to innocence, not just to people's own innocence, but their children's. It's like their children can do no wrong. And, these iOS people who are serially mass murdering babies, I'm sure a lot of them were told, you're so precious, you're golden. So the issue really wasn't that they themselves did not feel that they had this divinity or this specialness, So I'm just kind of like, I'm qualifying here because I feel like there's this centering of people who should be given a chance, where it's like, that's not really the point for me. It's like, yeah, they're human, but they're also monstrous. And we've all got that monstrosity in us, but how do we stop the monstrosity?
Yeah, for me, the point isn't whether people should have the chance, whether they're justified, whether they're excusable. For me, the point is, how do we make it stop? How do we create conditions where this no longer happens? To do that, we need to understand why it's happening. And what I'm saying is that the interpretive habit, the template of understanding that we have inherited that says, well, they're just terrible people. That is a kind of a non-explanation. That is kind of an escape from an explanation. And it's
but I would go the other way. Yeah. I would go the other way and say, though, that we're all just this divine is another escape. That doesn't really work either.
Yeah, it's a starting point, though, because then you ask, okay, what does it take for someone who started out as a cute, innocent little sweetums, a baby, to turn into somebody who commits mass murder, or who cheers for mass murder, or who refuses to see the humanity of others? What does it take for that to happen? Yeah. And that is the question we need to start asking. And it's hard to ask it when the off-ramp is offered onto hating rather than seeking to understand. So that's what I'm saying. If we understand it, then we can actually meet it at the root. If we don't understand it, then we're left fighting the symptom, which, I'm not saying that's a bad thing. But just to protect innocent people, and I don't care why the perpetrators are doing it, I'm just going to protect them. I'm fine with that. Except that sometimes the ways that we attempt to protect them in unconscious ways feed the whole climate that engenders that kind of behavior in the first place. And yeah, this is it would take actually quite a lot of time to really flesh out that idea, but maybe you can kind of see where I'm going with it.
I do. I think that's the basis of a lot of old religion and new religion too, new spirituality. Just like, let's focus on the divinity. and that inner enlightenment, and then we can go from there. But I kind of see that for example, like religions that espouse peace, like the yoga traditions and some Buddhist traditions, it's like they've been very late or non-existent coming to the plate about the Holocaust that's happening now. So it's like if that is a pathway, I don't see it working for them. You see what I'm saying? I don't see it working.
Yeah, I mean, I think that whatever your spiritual beliefs are, there's some bridging that needs to be done.
I'm not saying all Buddhists or all Hindus or all Christians or all Jews or anything. I'm saying that for people who consider it like faith or practice the center of their lives, a lot of them have been very late or non-existent coming to the plate to speak out against genocide.
Yeah, that's for sure.
But thank you. That's my 2 cents.
So, Marie, do you want to go to the breakout?
We need to go to breakouts.
Yeah.
Would you remind people what their topic would be?
So the question comes up, if we do not change people's beliefs through the force of evidence and logic, then how do beliefs change? Because darn it, we gotta, this world needs some pretty big changes in its stories and beliefs. So how does that actually happen? And maybe that question can be answered with stories that we can share with each other, either about how you changed beliefs. Was it somebody just debated you out of your belief, or did something happen? How did a deeply held belief of yours change? Or how did you witness a deeply held belief of somebody else change? Like what was that process? Tell a little story, come up with maybe just the essence of the story so that it doesn't take too much time. But that's what I would invite you to share in the breakout groups.
And I want to remind everybody that the breakout groups, we don't come back to this room. You just go to your breakout room, have your conversation, leave when you feel that the time is right. And then once everybody leaves all of the breakout rooms, then I come back and I close out the whole Zoom room. But we won't come back to this space. So I'm going to stop the recording